Now you get to watch me record ALC. Hello and welcome to another episode of Dive Deep a la carte with Lance Phelps. This is another look at John Frame's book, No Other God. It's a really awesome book, and it is dealing with it's basically a response to Open Theism. So far he's done a pretty good job. In our last episode, we took a look at the opening, kind of a primer to get us started on this rebuttal to Open Theism. And now we are going to be continuing our look. And in this chapter 2, we are going to take a look at where does Open Theism come. Now, it is important to start back at the beginning to a certain degree, but Frame wants to note that this book is really not meant to be a history book to tell us exactly where our Open Theism comes from. But one of the tenets of Open Theism, one of the things that Clark Pinnock and William Haskers and people that are prominent Open Theists put forward is that the Open Theist position is a really new position, and that actually is something that is good for. That's something that we should be happy about, that we should be looking at it and go, oh yeah, this lends to its credibility because of its newness, because of its modernity. It is, in their view, something that responds well to our modern culture, and it takes into account the things that our modern culture has uncovered. So our modern culture has basically effectively been able to better see what they say has been present for a while, but now we can see it really well. Well, their emphasis on the new is, as we will see, misplaced, because the emphasis on the new is something that disregards some key and fundamental aspects of Open Theism, namely libertarian free will. That libertarian free will is something that is actually quite ancient. You see, in the Greek philosophies that we see, various different Greek philosophies, like in Aristotle, Plato, the Epicureans, Anaximenes, and Anaximander, they themselves held to a very strong view. Well, depending on the philosopher, it kind of fluctuates between the two, but they held to a view of libertarian free will. And for Epicurus, libertarian free will actually explains why we can be morally responsible. Frame writes, historians of philosophy would add that the idea goes back even further. To Greek philosopher Epicurus, he believed that the world was made up of tiny atoms that normally move downward in vertical lines. But if these atoms are to combine, and produce larger objects, they must occasionally swerve from the vertical. This swerving is unpredictable and random. For Epicurus, swerving explains the formation of objects and also the nature of human freedom and responsibility. So we see that the view is not necessarily a new view, the view that the libertarian freedom, which is actually very commonly held today, and it was commonly held back then. So when we look further, though, into the various different aspects, we see that not only were quite a few early philosophers, they held to libertarian freedom, but there are aspects that classical theism and the process theology, I guess it was not exactly like process theology, because we have to remember process theology is different from Open Theism. Open Theism tends to place things on a more Arminian playing field, whereas process theology it deviates from more orthodox theologies to a great degree. But when we look at the two different views of God, we actually see that the Open Theists place a heavy emphasis on the fact that, and especially people like Clark Pinnock, they place a heavy emphasis on the idea that the God of the traditional theism, classical theism, that Arminians and Calvinists and other Orthodox Christians hold to, they place that they basically say that there's so much influence by the Greek philosophers on that their God that you can't actually have an accurate portrayal of God. But of course, this is something that is inaccurate, and John Frame points this out. But not only that, but he points out that Open Theism itself also has a lot to take credit from, or it has a lot that it derives from classic Greek philosophy. In fact, quite a bit more than I think that they want to admit. And moving forward, we see that Open Theists have a lot to, credit to Socinianism. In fact, they're so similar to Socinianism, it's a wonder that they don't call themselves Socinians. John Frame actually quotes Robert Strimple here when he says, against the Arminians, Against the Arminians, the Socinians insisted that logically the Calvinists were quite correct in insisting that the only real basis for believing that God knows what you are going to do next is to believe that he has foreordained what you are going to do next. How else could God know ahead of time what your decision will be? Like the Arminians, however, the Socinians insisted that it was a contradiction of human freedom to believe in the sovereignty or the sovereign foreordination of God. So they went all the way logically and denied not only that God has foreordained the free decisions of free agents, but also that God foreknows what those decisions will be. Furthermore, Frame notes that the Socinian viewpoint and the open theist viewpoint just comes right together when it comes to God's omniscience. Their description of God's omniscience is the open theist viewpoint is that God cannot know that which is not in existence. I actually read this as well in William Hasker's Metaphysics. His point was that God cannot know what is not knowable, in that if something doesn't exist, then God himself cannot know it. So their argument is that God knows all that is knowable. That is everything that is present, that is presently happening and that has happened in the past. So his omniscience, therefore, according to Clark Pinnock and William Haskers and other open theists, has not been violated. Well, Frame notes in his book here that the fact is that's Socinian to the core. That's exactly the way Socinians interact with God's omniscience. Next, Frame moves into more modern influences, modern as in like David Hume and other of those modern philosophers that have influenced open theism. And he outlines how these modern philosophies have actually influenced open theism. In this quote, we see David Hume suggested in his dialogues concerning natural religion that a finite God might be sufficient to meet the needs of faith. John Stuart Mill agreed. Immanuel Kant moved God from the realm of human experience, in part to make room for libertarian freedom. German and British idealists taught the absolute being is correlative to the world of space and time. That is, that God and the world are mutually dependent. William James taught the existence of a finite God who struggles with us to combat evil. For him, God must be finite if we are to be free, and James identified freedom with chance. So we see quite a bit of modern influences in the open theist movement, but this is something that the open theists oftentimes don't say is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, they identify it as a good thing in some cases. But the question is, should the open theists have such a reverence for the new or for the modern? And I think that personally the answer is an unequivocal no, primarily because the modern has demonstrated such and I do mean this by modern, semi-secular and secular philosophies, they have demonstrated such a deviation from the Bible itself in its clear spoken words, specifically on the sovereignty of God and his foreordination of events. So the question has to be asked, is the open theist idea of God and the sovereignty of God versus the libertarian free will of man, is that a new idea? And I think that the answer is obviously no. It's not even close to new. We found ideas that basically correlate to the open theist viewpoint clearly presented in Greek philosophy and in other philosophers throughout the history of mankind, and more recently in modernist philosophy, such that we find in David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and we find in Socinianism that we have a presentation of God's omniscience and other aspects of God that is very distinctly, easily correlated to the viewpoints that are presented by open theism. So the answer is that no, open theism is not a new belief system. I'm going to go ahead and close this a la carte with this quote from John Frame. Open theism is distinctive mainly as a theological movement. It has brought together a group of writers who are more or less of one mind on these matters, with the definite intention of persuading the church to go their way. The open theists have authored and co-authored a number of books that many have found persuasive. They have presented their ideas vividly, with passion and excitement. The appeal of open theism, in other words, is in its presentation rather than in the freshness of its ideas.